Mike, a 45-year-old man, had spent over 15 years working at Richard's company as a mid-level project manager. He wasn't a genius, but he was hardworking, dedicated, and always gave his best for the company. From a young age, Mike joined the company with hopes of building a stable career. Over the years, he watched the company grow from a small business into a large corporation, thanks to loyal employees like him. Mike never hesitated to work overtime, accepted low pay, and even helped the company navigate through crises. However, despite all his efforts, he never received the recognition he truly deserved. On the other side of the spectrum was Richard, the company's CEO, a highly ambitious businessman, but also a ruthless and selfish individual. He cared little for his employees, focusing only on profits and power. Always seen in expensive suits, driving luxury cars, and living in a lavish mansion, Richard believed the company's success was solely due to his exceptional leadership. In reality, it was people like Mike who were the backbone of the company's growth. Richard had a ruthless philosophy. No employee was irreplaceable. The company was his, and employees were merely tools for making money. If someone dared to ask for a raise, they could be fired on the spot. And unfortunately, Mike had no idea that he was about to become the next victim of that very philosophy. The work environment in the company had become increasingly harsh. Mike had proposed numerous innovative ideas to help the company grow, but most of them were either dismissed or outright stolen by Richard. Mike's colleagues also felt dissatisfied, but they were too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up. Every time Mike asked for a raise or a promotion, Richard would respond with empty promises. "You are very important to the company, but now is not the right time. Just wait a little longer." Yet that little longer stretched into 5 years with no changes. Mike could have left long ago, but having spent nearly his entire youth at the company, he still held on to the hope that one day Richard would recognize his contributions. But that was a grave mistake. In recent months, the company had begun cutting costs. Richard started hiring younger employees for lower salaries and began considering eliminating veteran employees to save on the budget. What Mike didn't know was that his name was already on the layoff list. While he was still dedicating himself wholeheartedly to the company, Richard was secretly preparing a plan to get rid of him without paying a single cent in severance. And then the fateful day arrived. That day started like any other. Mike arrived at the office early, made himself a cup of coffee, and prepared for the weekly meeting. He had no idea that in this very meeting, his fate had already been decided. As everyone settled into their seats, Richard walked in with a cold expression and announced that the company was undergoing a restructuring to optimize costs. The leadership team had made the difficult decision to reduce staff, and unfortunately, Mike was among those affected. No words of appreciation for over 15 years of dedication, no severance pay, just a termination letter and a reluctant handshake from Richard. Mike was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this really how the company treated a loyal employee who had spent nearly 2 decades working tirelessly? All the late nights, the unpaid overtime, the projects he had taken on to save the company during crises, wiped away with a single ruthless decision. When he tried to question it, Richard simply shrugged, showing no emotion. "This is just a business decision, nothing personal. I'm sure you'll find a better opportunity." Rage boiled inside Mike, but he knew arguing with Richard wouldn't change anything. He left the office in silence, carrying a box of his personal belongings and the sympathetic yet fearful gazes of his former colleagues. Some looked at him with regret, but no one dared to stand up for him. Everyone was afraid of Richard, afraid that if they spoke up, they would be next. That day, Mike walked out of the building he had devoted more than 15 years of his life to. But instead of feeling defeated, something inside him ignited. A fire of determination he had never felt before. If this company could discard him so easily, then he would prove to them that they had made a terrible mistake. Mike was no longer a victim. He decided that he wouldn't just look for another job, he would do something bolder. He would come back stronger than ever and make those who underestimated him pay the price. And so, a plan for revenge began to take shape. In the first few days after being fired, Mike felt bitter and lost. But instead of drowning in the injustice, he decided to turn his anger into motivation. He spent his time studying, learning business knowledge he had never had the chance to explore before. He reconnected with industry contacts, former clients he had worked with, and step by step, he built a bold plan to start his own company and take on Richard directly. With only a small amount of savings, Mike couldn't launch a large-scale business right away, but he knew he had one major advantage: real-world experience and a deep understanding of the industry. He found a new, more modern, and cost-effective approach, one that focused on solving the very problems that Richard's company had ignored. The clients Richard had once dismissed now saw value in Mike's services because they knew he was truly capable, not just someone who profited off the hard work of others. At first, starting a business wasn't easy. Mike had to handle everything on his own, from financial planning and marketing to customer service. He worked day and night, but this time it wasn't to make someone else rich. It was to build a future for himself. Thanks to the good reputation he had built over the years, clients began to shift toward him, one by one. Former employees of Richard, those who had also suffered under his unfair leadership, started reaching out to Mike, asking to join his new company. They believed in him. They believed in a fair work environment where real talent was recognized and valued. Within just 2 years, Mike's company grew from a small startup into a formidable competitor in the industry. Richard's clients gradually abandoned his firm, realizing they had a better option: a company led by someone with true ethics and talent. Meanwhile, Richard's company started to struggle. His best employees had left, revenues declined, and his reputation in the business world continued to crumble. Mike never forgot what Richard had done to him, but instead of focusing solely on revenge, he let his success be the ultimate response. And then, the fateful day arrived. The day Richard, the man who had once mocked him, had to bow his head and beg for an opportunity. But Mike was no longer the overlooked employee he once was. He was now the one in control. And he would make sure that injustice never repeated itself again. For the past 2 years, Richard had remained convinced that his company was an industry giant, untouchable and invincible. He failed to realize that his ruthless decisions were slowly pushing his empire to the brink of collapse. As his top employees left one by one, as loyal clients began shifting to competitors, Richard dismissed it all as temporary setbacks. But then, he finally saw the truth. The competitor who was steadily stealing his market share was none other than Mike, the very man he had fired without hesitation. At first, Richard refused to believe that an ex-employee he had cast aside could pose any real threat. But as revenues plummeted, major contracts were lost, and investors grew uneasy, he was forced to face reality. He had made a catastrophic mistake. Mike's company wasn't just growing, it was taking over the entire industry. The once unshakable sense of power that Richard had enjoyed was now slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, he felt panic. Things only got worse as debt piled up. Investors pulled out one after another, and the company sank into a deep financial crisis. With no talented employees left, no loyal clients to rely on, Richard finally felt the crushing weight of running a company without people like Mike by his side. In the end, Richard's company stood on the edge of bankruptcy. With no other choice, he was forced to sell assets, downsize operations, and watch everything he had built crumble before his eyes. But the greatest humiliation was yet to come. Richard had to apply for a job just to survive, and in the cruelest twist of fate, he unknowingly submitted his application to Mike's company. The day Richard walked into the interview, he had no idea that the man sitting in the CEO's chair was the very employee he had mocked and discarded 2 years ago. When their eyes met, Richard froze in disbelief. Mike, now calm and collected, studied him with an unreadable smile. This wasn't just an interview. This was justice, revenge, and the ultimate reversal of fate. Mike slowly stood up and walked toward Richard. The balance of power had completely shifted. No longer a disregarded employee, Mike was now a respected and successful business owner. Meanwhile, Richard, the man who once believed he could trample over anyone, was now standing before him, desperate for a job. A heavy silence filled the room, and then Mike finally spoke, his voice soft but razor sharp. "Didn't you once say I was useless? And now you're here?" asking me for a job. Richard lowered his head, speechless, but Mike had yet to make his final decision, and now he would choose how to end this bitter story. On Richard's first day at Mike's company, no one in the office recognized him as the once powerful CEO. He no longer had a luxurious office, no personal assistant, and no high-level meetings. Instead, he was assigned a small desk in the corner of the office, handling basic administrative tasks, the kind of work he had once dismissed as beneath him. Every day he had to watch Mike, the man he once looked down upon, now leading a thriving company respected by employees and partners alike. Richard slowly began to understand that true success didn't come from exploiting or oppressing others, but from how one treated the people around them. Meanwhile, Mike continued to elevate his company to new heights. He didn't just build a successful business, he created a fair workplace where effort was recognized and employees were treated with respect. His company quickly became one of the fastest growing businesses in the industry, attracting top talent and expanding nationwide. As for Richard, he grew quieter, no longer carrying himself with the arrogance of his past. He observed Mike's employees, young, ambitious individuals who were given opportunities he had never allowed his own workers to have. He realized that his downfall wasn't caused by Mike's success, but by his own failure as a leader. His company had been a place without loyalty, without respect for people, and that was why it had collapsed. One day, after finishing a stack of paperwork, Richard quietly stepped into Mike's office and said something he never thought he'd have to say. "Thank you." Mike simply nodded, saying nothing. He didn't need an apology. He didn't need Richard's submission. His greatest victory wasn't in making Richard work under him. It was in proving that justice prevailed, that those who were once oppressed would one day rise again. A few months later, Richard resigned and left the company. He was no longer the man he once was, but perhaps he had learned the most important lesson of his life. When you mistreat others, one day you will pay the price. Mike, however, no longer cared about Richard. He kept moving forward, unwavering on the path he had chosen. He didn't just change his own life. He changed the way an entire generation of employees viewed fairness in the workplace. And to him, that was the greatest victory of all.